I appreciate Keith doing the Lord's Supper, and especially, and also Fred with the singing. Does a great job. Better him than me, so I appreciate what Fred does, and I don't have to do it. But he does a great job. Really appreciate it. Okay, we're still in our study of the book of Ephesians, but I'm going to look at one of the issues that comes up in the passage, or rather in the last passage that we looked at. So we're going to look at the, if you like, the role of the Old Testament today. Primarily, we're going to look at whether the Old Testament is in any way in force today. I think there's a huge amount of confusion in the religious world in general. Very often when you ask people what's important as far as our obedience to God is concerned, they'll say to keep the 10 Commandments. And that's a very real belief in the religious world, not in what we would understand as people who know the Bible, but in the religious world in general, the 10 Commandments have a very high place. So we want to have a look at actually what, if any, Old Testament laws are required of us today. This comes from Ephesians 2. We looked at this section last week, but we'll start off with Ephesians 2 verses 14 through 16. For he himself was our peace, who made both one and broke down the dividing wall of the partition, the enmity in his flesh, invalidating the law of commandments and ordinances, in order that he might create the two in himself into one new man, thus making peace, and might reconcile both in one body to God through the cross, killing the enmity in himself. Now notice there he broke down the dividing wall of the partition, and he referred to that as the enmity. He broke it down in his flesh, and he further kind of elaborates on what he's talking about there. He says he invalidating in verse Ephesians 2:15, invalidating the law of commands and ordinances. That has to be referring to the Old Testament, which was basically a collection of laws which the Jewish people were required to follow. The purpose of invalidating or killing those laws and validating that law was that Jesus or God might create the two in himself into one new man. The two there being the Jews and the Gentiles. Whereas before God's people were only the Jews, as a result of doing away with this dividing wall or this law and commandments, he made the two into one, thus created the two in himself into one new man, thus making peace. And that's making peace between God and man, but also between the two Jew and Gentile groups, and might reconcile both in one body to God through the cross. And notice in this passage he says, killing the enmity in himself. The enmity there, I think, is referring to that law of the fact that the Jews had God's commandments and the Gentiles didn't. Then a parallel passage to that is Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 through 14. If you look at 14, having destroyed the certificate of indebtedness and ordinances. So he's basically saying the same thing using slightly different words, but he destroyed the certificate of indebtedness in ordinances. The certificate of indebtedness, I think, is probably the sins the ordinances that they disobeyed, which led to a certificate, if you like, of their failure as the people of God, which was hostile to us, and removed it out of the way. Notice here he says by nailing it to the cross. The previous passage we looked at, he says killing the enmity in himself. And in this one he says nailing it to the cross, talking about exactly the same thing, just use slightly different words in both cases. So the killing the enmity, that was done at the same time as he nailed it to the cross. So the Old Testament, or rather this law of commands, was taken out of the way, killed, invalidated, according to these two passages, when Jesus died on the cross. So Jesus basically did live during the old law period. But in the process of his living, he began giving us teachings that would apply under the New Testament. Now, there's a number of different passages where Paul reasons why, or a certain thing about the Old and New Testament. Although to us it looks pretty straightforward, to the Jews and to the new Christians during this time, it was not quite as straightforward. A lot of the Jews, even those who had become Christians, wanted to maintain certain aspect of the Jewish laws. Circumcision was a big one, but I'm sure there were others. The various festivals, they probably encouraged Christians to keep various festivals, just all sorts of things. So it wasn't initially as clear-cut. So Paul had to spend quite a bit of time reasoning with them to try and get them to understand a certain thing about our relationship to the Old Testament. What I want to do is look at the main passages where Paul does this. When I was looking at some of the YouTube clips on this subject, as I think I told you last week, quite a few I would totally agree with. But the way they tried to prove their case was simply to say, Ephesians 6:8 says this, Galatians 3:17, whatever it says this, but he didn't actually look at what the passages actually said. He just said, these are the verses that prove my point, so you better believe me. But people aren't convinced by that. If you don't know what's actually in a verse, when you quote the numbers of the verse, all you are quoting is numbers. That's not going to convince anyone of anything. In fact, there were no numbers in the New Testament when it was originally written. Weren't even chapter headings. If they wanted to prove a point, they had to actually quote what the New Testament itself said. So I want to kind of take that approach. So I want to look at especially the important passages that deal with this subject and go through it and try to understand the reasoning that Paul is using to prove his point. And in the end, if we're going to have these discussions with people, that's the only way you're going to win your case. If they already believe you've got to keep some Old Testament laws, just giving numbers isn't going to change their mind. The only way they're going to have their mind changed is by actually looking at what especially Paul, and to some extent I guess Jesus, but especially Paul, the way he reasons to try and change the people in the first century's opinion of this. And we know even Peter was to somewhat influenced by the Jews who said you've got to keep certain festivals and you've got to keep circumcision and that. Paul had to oppose him. So it was a very common thing. So, okay, there's two passages I want to look at in Hebrews. One is in Hebrews 8, one is in Hebrews 10. So we'll start with Hebrews 8. I'm going to take as long as it takes to get through these passages, which doesn't mean I'm going to be here till 2 o'clock. It means if when the half hour's up, I'll stop. And if I've got more to do, I'll do more next week. Okay, so Hebrews 8, starting in verse 6. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also mediator of a better covenant, which is enacted on better promises. So this passage starts off by talking about something that is better than something else. Notice it's more excellent. He has attained a more excellent ministry. I believe the he there is Jesus. He's also a mediator of a better covenant. That's got to be comparing the old covenant with the new covenant. One's better, and if one's better, the other one is worse. And when we get to chapter 10, we'll see that brought out more. And it's also enacted on better promises. So the whole basis of this passage is the fact that this new covenant is better than the old covenant. And remember, there are Jews wanting to go back and wanting to convince Christians to actually go back and follow certain aspects of the Old Testament. even though those particular Jews would call themselves Christians, but they still thought they needed to follow some of those Old Testament teachings. Okay, in verse 7, notice now, for if the first covenant had been faultless, if it was faultless, occasion would not have been sought for a second. The argument there is the Old Testament is basically flawed. It was a good law as far as laws go, but as far as trying to help anyone be sinless before God, which is what the whole of the Bible is trying to get us to become, it was totally inadequate. This is saying we needed a new covenant because the old one was not what it needed to be to achieve God's goals for us. So if it hadn't been faultless, there would have been no need for a second. The second being what replaced the first. For in finding fault with them, he says, and now this is a quote from Jeremiah. Now Jeremiah was probably operating somewhere around 600 BC. We don't have specific dates for a lot of things in the Old Testament. We've just got to, the experts who look at this just go through and look at different occasions and maybe when one particular king was ruling, we know that. So certain events happened around that, so we can kind of identify roughly what time that was. So in Jeremiah's case, somewhere around is a rough figure about 600 BC. So this passage that Paul quotes here, notice he's quoting an Old Testament passage, and that's significant when we see what the Old Testament passage actually says in relation to the first law. He says, behold, days are coming, not that they were here yet, but days are coming, says the Lord, when I will complete a new covenant with the house of Israel. They were in the middle of the first covenant. So Jeremiah says, look, days are coming when there's going to be a new covenant. So even under the Old Testament times, there's evidence that that system, that covenant was going to be replaced by a new one. So days are coming, says the Lord, when I will complete a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Talking about basically the same thing. Israel was a general term, and really in the end, Judah became the main representative of Judaism. In verse 9, not like the covenant I made with their fathers. So this is going to be a different covenant to the one that was made with Moses and those who followed. On the day I took hold of them by hand and led them out of the land of Egypt. Obviously, they're talking about the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments, the first covenant. So after the first covenant, there's going to be a new covenant. Because, this is the last part of verse 9, because they did not continue in my covenant, in other words, they were disobedient to it, and I disregarded them, says the Lord. Verse 10, for this is the covenant that I will decree with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. So then he kind of describes what this new covenant that's going to, if you like, replace the old covenant is going to be like. I will put my laws in their mind. I will write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. That's kind of the characteristic of it. The Jews, in a large sense, were forced to follow the Old Testament. There were penalties if they didn't and various other things. The New Testament, though, it's going to be a situation where people actually want to be the children of God and doing it because that's, if you like, an expression of their heart. We're all here because we want to be here. Not because, like under a human law, if you break the law, you're in danger of going to prison, getting a fine, whatever it is. We're here because we want to be here. If we choose not to be here, we cannot be here. And there may be no consequences in this life. There will be in the life to come, but not in this one. So I will put my laws in their minds. As part of their thinking, they will just think in terms of spiritual principles. I will write them on their heart. I will be their God. Literally it says, I will be to them for God. In other words, under the new covenant, we will choose Jehovah to be our God. That's, I think, literally what it's saying. Out of all the gods they could have possibly followed, or we could have possibly followed, especially under the pagan system, we choose Jehovah. That's the idea here. And they will be my people, again, literally, and they to me are for people. And God chooses us for the same reason. That's the nature of this new covenant. And verse 11, and they will not teach each one his fellow citizen and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord. That's kind of interesting. I don't believe it's saying we won't teach other people what the principles are. But the emphasis here is fellow citizens and brothers. In other words, the fellow citizens for a Jew at this time was another Jew. They felt no responsibility whatsoever to encourage those outside of the Jewish nation to become Jews. Some did, but there was no emphasis on it. In fact, they were kind of encouraged to stay away from people who were not Jews. We won't teach our fellow Jewish citizens because they will all know me. In other words, everyone will have the same access to God. So the emphasis is really on who is being taught. We can now teach everyone who wants to listen. They could only really teach their Jewish brothers. Then in verse 12, for I will be merciful towards their wrongdoings. Remember, we're talking about what the new covenant is going to be like. Under the Old Testament, there wasn't a lot of mercy as the Old Testament was written. For I will be merciful towards their wrongdoings, and I will not remember their sins any longer. At best, under the Old Testament law, their sins were covered up for a certain amount of time. And on the Day of Atonement, they had to make all these sacrifices and different things. And they had to do that every year. So, in a sense, that kind of covered their sins for the year. But at the end of the year, they had to do it again. Under the New Testament, that forgiveness of sins was a permanent thing. Once you had your sins forgiven, that was permanent. It didn't need to be done over and over and over again for the same sins. You commit new sins, you might have to, there's a process we have to go through for forgiveness, but not for the sins before that first time. Okay, and this is the point Paul is making, or the writer of Hebrews is making in verse 13. But remember, this passage is written something like 600 BC. So in calling it new, this new covenant that God is going to make with people, in calling it new, he has declared the former to be old. Now, the term old and new doesn't mean so much in date. It has partly that idea, but it means a more improved version. And I sort of said a bit last week about computers. First computer I bought in about 1990 or something like that really wouldn't function today. It's not that suddenly it stopped working, although it probably has by now, but you just can't get programs that'll run on it, It just doesn't fit in with what we have today. That's more the idea, new and improved. I was thinking this morning about my first car I ever bought. It was Austin A50, had no heater. In those days, if you got up to 70 mile an hour, you're taking your life in your hands. Fair go. There were all sorts of problems with it. The distributor wasn't attached to the engine very well, and occasionally it would jump out, and then it'd drop back in, and there'd be a mighty great backfire. And, it just, whereas the cars we've got today, wonderful things. That still worked, but what we have now is so much better. That's really the idea of this new and old here. And then he says, now what is becoming obsolete, in other words, the Old Testament, even at this time, he said, is heading towards being obsolete. And obsolete means replaced by something new and better. And growing old is near to disappearing. When I kind of first read this, I thought, well, that's funny, Paul saying the old covenant is near to disappearing. Because this, Hebrews was written 50, 60, I can't remember exactly when. But that's not what he's referring to. He's referring to even when Jeremiah wrote this passage. That's what he's referring back to. Even then, it is heading towards disappearing. Okay. The next passage I want to look at is Hebrews chapter 10. And we'll go through verses 5 through 10. Therefore, when he came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offering you did not want, but a body you prepared for me. Now, this is making, again, a basic statement. And then he's going to elaborate, if you like, on this statement through the rest of this passage. Then verse 6, you did not delight in whole burnt offerings and offerings for sin. So in other words, God never really wanted all the sacrifices and offerings that were made. And the sacrifices and offerings that he's talking about are the burnt offerings, sin offerings, etc. That was the Old Testament, what they did under the Old Testament covenant, the Old Covenant. So what this is saying, God never really wanted that. And when we get to Galatians chapter 3, we'll see that brought out a little bit more. Verse 7, then I said, behold, I have come in the roll of the book, it is written about me, to do your will, O God. Now, just if you read that, verse 7, you wouldn't have any idea what he's talking about. But he expands on that in the next few verses. Okay, verse 8. When he says above, sacrifice and offerings and whole burnt offerings and offerings for sin you did not want, nor did you delight in, which are offerings according to the law. So he makes it specifically clear he's talking about the Old Testament. In other words, God never really wanted these. That wasn't his primary aim when it came to his dealings with man. The problem was this became the primary thing in relation to man and God. For the Jews. For the Jews, that was the important thing, all these things. But God is saying, no, in actual fact, that was never the most important thing. And in verse 9, then he has said, behold, I have come to do your will. And again, just if you just read that, you wouldn't know what he was talking about. So carrying on in verse 9, he takes away the first, and what he's been talking about is what resulted in the sacrifices, offerings, etc., was the old law. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. Second's the New Testament, first the Old Testament. Paul clearly says God took that law away. And in verse 10, by which will we are made holy through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Commenting on the much greater effectiveness, much greater importance that the New Testament law has over the Old. That whole thing was replaced by the death of Jesus. That's what this passage is saying. Under the Old Testament, they had to make these offerings for sin over and over again. The individuals didn't, but the priesthood did. That was the role of the priesthood. The role of the priesthood in the Old Testament wasn't so much preaching, it was taking care of what was needed in the temple. Later, somewhat in the synagogue, but the synagogue wasn't something that was designed by God. It was something that the Jews themselves developed during, I think, the Babylonian captivity when they were away from Jerusalem. But when they came back, They just carried it on. Okay, now let's get to Galatians chapter 3. And the reasoning in this passage, I think, is very important for us. So Galatians chapter 3, starting at verse 15. Brothers, I am speaking according to a human perspective. So from a human point of view, that's what he's saying, in terms of the way humans do it. Nevertheless, when the covenant of a man has been ratified, in other words, brought into law, made effective, no one declares it invalid or adds additional provisions to it. So in terms of human thinking, especially in the way they did things then, once you have set this as a covenant, but it may be a contract, once that has been duly established according to the law, you can't just simply wipe it out and establish something different. And when he comes to the argument he's making in this, that's really important. So no one can declare it invalid or can add provisions to it once it's duly established. So if I make a contract with Keith, then later on I say, oh no, I don't like that provision, even though we both signed it, we both agreed on it. It's been notarized, it's properly established, and then later on I want to change something on it. Legally, I can't do that. I'd be in breach of contract. That's what he's talking about here. So he's saying even in human point of view, that's the case. The emphasis is if God does this, it's even more secure. Verse 16. Now to Abraham and to his descendants, the promises were spoken. Now the promise here, he's kind of equating to this covenant that's made. The promises became a covenant, if you like, between God and man. Notice it does not say, and to descendants. So it's going back to verse 16. Now to Abraham and to his descendant, singular. The Jews considered this applied to them. How they got around the singular, I don't know what their logic was, but they did. But Paul here is going back and saying, no, if you look at the original covenant that God made with Abraham, it was not to descendants in the plural, it was simply to a descendant. That's why the Jews felt, this land promise was forever to them, and for all of them. But Paul here is saying, no, it was never made to all of you. So it does not say and to descendants, plural, as concerning many, but as concerning one, and to your descendant. So the promise God made to Abraham was not including all the Jews, all his descendants, but to simply one descendant, who is Christ. So God hasn't failed to keep his promises to the Jews by no longer having them as his sole people. That's what he is saying. Now I've tried to find probably the passages that Paul is actually talking about in this particular case. I've listed a couple. First one, Genesis 12, 1 through 3. And Yahweh said to Abraham, go out from your land and from your relatives and from the house of your father to the land that I will show you. So wherever he was, he ended up going out to Israel. Or Ur of the Chaldees, I think it was called then. That's where he went. Verse 2, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. And I will make your name great, which very literally is happening. Abraham is a a great man revered by three, if you like, world religions: the Jewish, the Christian, and the Islamic. All of them claim him as great, which is exactly what this passage says. And you will be a blessing. So here the promise is actually that Abraham will be the one who becomes famous and will be made great. And I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you I will curse. And all families of the earth will be blessed in you. So that clearly, when it says all families will be blessed, the intention even back then was that God's blessing would come to all people, not just the children of Abraham. And then we've got Genesis 12:7, which may be the one Paul is referring to here. And Yahweh appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring. And when you look up the number in that word offspring, it is in the singular in the Old Testament, in Jewish. I don't understand anything about Jewish. All I can go by is how it's defined by the scholars that study it. And it's described as in the singular, which is exactly what Paul is saying. To your offspring, singular, I will give this land. So even in the original promise to Abraham, he was in fact not talking about the Jewish nation in general, but just one individual offspring of Abraham. The Jews assumed he was meaning everyone. That's why they thought that this land is ours in perpetuity. But even what they were basing that belief on does not say that. Israel is not the Jews by right, if you go back to Abraham. And he built an altar there to Yahweh who had appeared to him. Okay? So the promise was never made to all the Israelites that was their land. It was only ever made to one descendant of Abraham, and Paul defined that one descendant as Jesus. So if Israel belongs to anybody, it belongs to Christians, those who follow Jesus, to be honest with you. And I think God tried to do that with the destruction of Jerusalem, but the English in their wisdom made it otherwise. Okay, not that I'm complaining about that. Everyone's got to have somewhere to live. Okay, now, so, verse 16, now to Abraham and to his descendants, the promises were spoken. It does not say, and to descendants, plural, as concerning many, but as concerning one, and to your descendant, who is Christ. And then down to verse 17, now I am saying this, right? As far as the law that came after 430 years does not revoke a covenant previously ratified by God in order to nullify the promise. Notice, we go back to the beginning of this Galatians chapter 3, does not say, when a covenant has been ratified, no one can change it. Okay? Verse 17, now I say this, the law that came after 430 years did not revoke a covenant previously ratified by God. Quite possibly the Jews are saying, look, if you bring in these Christian laws, you are invalidating the Old Testament laws, the law of Moses, etc. That's wrong, you can't do that. But Paul is saying here, look, you haven't really understood the actual law or covenant that God ratified that was to be the permanent one. Okay? The law that came 430 years does not revoke a covenant previously ratified by God. Yes, I know the law of Moses was brought in, but that cannot change just because it was brought in the original covenant made with Abraham. And we'll look later on as why it was brought in. Okay? That old covenant made with Abraham is still in force. The law was brought in to achieve something, but it can't take away that original agreement or covenant that God made with Abraham. Okay? But notice the law of Moses, which became to the Jews the most important thing, actually came 430 years after that covenant that God made with Abraham. Now, I went back and tried to have a look at sort of roughly the dates to give us a bit of an idea. The law of Moses was probably given somewhere between 1400 and 1500 BC. So 14 to 1500 years before Jesus. The law, the original covenant, which is still the covenant even during this time, was given roughly 430 years before that. So somewhere between 1800 and 1900 BC. So we're talking about actually a pretty long period of time. The only covenant that basically existed between Abraham and the giving of the law was this original covenant given. So when this original covenant, which became so important, cannot replace the original one. So it's still in force. The original one is still in force. If we want to go back to what God's actual covenant was with man, you've got to go back to the one between God and Abraham, not the law. And remember, Paul is arguing that the law is no longer in force. Okay, verse 18, for if the inheritance is from the law, why? Why do we got to go back to that original covenant, 1900 BC, made between God and Abraham? For if the inheritance is from the law, it is no longer from the promise. So if we make what's important to man the law, we've actually invalidated the promise. In other words, we can't do that. We can't worry about the promise because that was the original one. The law was just brought in as a stopgap measure for a particular purpose. So what he's saying is stop trying to promote the law. It's inadequate. It's nothing. But God graciously gave it to Abraham through the promise. God gave the real covenant to Abraham through the promises that he made to Abraham. Okay, we're pretty much out of time. Dee's been flashing me, giving me the hand signals. And we've still got a bit to go, so we'll leave it there and we'll carry on with that next week. If you want to go through these passages, so what I say makes more sense next week, and that will also help you remember it over time, I think that would be useful. One thing I am working on, and I'm pretty slow with this, I'm trying to develop a kind of like a note card system on your telephone, where if you want to look at a subject, in this case, the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you can just go to this app on your phone and it lists off all these passages. So if you're talking with someone, like a Jehovah's Witness comes and knocks on the door and say, we should be, whatever. We've got to be following the Old Testament. That's why we keep the Seventh-day Adventist. Why we keep the seventh day as holy. And you can't think of the passages offhand, you can just pull out your telephone and hang on, I'll just find those verses. And they'll be listed, categorized. I've done one on baptism, one on the Lord's Supper. I'm trying to do it on what's called Google Notes. And if I understand Google Notes correctly, you can synchronize, if one does something on one thing, you can synchronize it with other Google Notes if you are logged into Google. So what I'm trying to do, if I can figure out how to do that, if you want it, I might be able to, once I've got a certain amount of them done, you can download them onto your telephone if you've got an Android phone. I haven't got Apple phone, so you'd have to have an Android phone to make it work. I've tried various ways, but this seems to be the best way of doing it. So as time goes by, I'll add more and more to them.